Today we've got Congressman Adam Schiff. Thanks so much for coming back on.
Great to be with you.
So as of this recording, Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin have both definitively shut down the Democrats' effort to create a carve-out in the filibuster for voting rights. So is the Freedom to Vote John Lewis Act, which is the combination of the Voting Rights Act and the Freedom to Vote Act, is that bill dead? And do the Democrats have any other plans to safeguard the right to vote?
I can't accept that it's dead because I think that would be catastrophic. And I know that the president is personally engaging on this, and we're going to have to count on the president as well as our Senate leadership to find a pathway to get that legislation through. I do not understand the opposition of Sinema or Manchin. It makes no sense to me. I think that they have a vision of the Senate that no longer exists. As some institution in which the minority leader, Mitch McConnell, is somehow interested in working in a bipartisan way on voting rights. That's antithetical to McConnell's entire political business model, which is disenfranchising people. They know that if more Americans vote, they lose. And so there's going to be no path to protecting voting rights as long as they can filibuster that in the Senate. So there has to be a way to overcome this. At the same time, I've been saying since the beginning of the session, we can't put all our eggs in the legislative basket. We're going to need a movement nationwide to push back against these disenfranchisement laws and determine whatever means are necessary to overcome them so that we can make sure that everybody's vote and voice are heard. So we have to use a dual-pronged strategy, but I think the statement that Sinema released was just devastating, and I do not understand at all where she's coming from.
Well, not being able, to accept the fact that we might not have a legislative remedy. I mean, like, what would we be able to do given that we don't have the votes to create any type of a carve out to the filibuster? Is there any other path, either legislatively or through the executive branch, that we could actually use to protect voting rights?
There are other paths. I think none of them are quite as good, although the legislation itself is not a complete answer either. And the paths are litigation. We can sue. We are suing. The Justice Department is suing to push back against the most draconian of these laws. But nonetheless, they're having a real impact. I was talking to one of my Texas colleagues today, Joaquin Castro, and he was telling me that they're having to in his district, where you can already apply for absentee ballots in the midterms for the primary, tens of thousands of people, a huge percentage of those applying or expressing interest in getting an absentee ballot are being refused because of these new laws. You see the very first clear indications of just what Republicans are trying to do in making it harder for people to vote. So there's litigation, but also what we really are going to need to do, because these laws are, multifarious and nefarious, is we're going to have to use a multi-pronged approach. And that is when they're trying to, for example, strip independent elections officials of their duties or drive them out of town with death threats, we're going to have to rally to the defense of these local officials, make sure that they're protected and can do their jobs. We're going to have to make sure that we have people running for these positions, which were considered fairly non-controversial, inconsequential, even in the fact that they weren't, high profile, but they are very consequential. So we're going to have to run people for these offices, protect people Democrats and Republicans who are devoted to the rule of law. And we're going to have to find ways to overcome these additional hurdles to voting.
This has probably been the most frustrating time for me, and I know a lot of other Democrats feel exactly the same way. And I've struggled to find words to adequately capture how insane it is to defer to the filibuster as a way to purportedly defend democracy and not voting rights, which literally are the basis of our democracy. Do you have a response to these Democratic holdouts, to Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, who've put themselves on the opposite side of this thing?
I think you're right. It's insane. It's insane. The idea that we would elevate this rule that has a sordid past of defending, Jim Crow laws, we would elevate that above protecting people's right to vote. It's absurd. What's more, you could see a correlation between the increased use in the filibuster over the last 10 or 20 years and increased partisanship, not bipartisanship. I'm not saying that necessarily one's the cause of the other, but they've gone hand in hand. It hasn't stopped the Senate from becoming a more partisan place, but it has allowed the minority to rule the Senate. And right now, that minority is killing, voting rights.
Yeah, that's a great point. You've also offered the Protecting Our Democracy Act, and that offers a sweeping set of reforms to root out corruption, like limiting the presidential abuses of power, strengthening the system of checks and balances that continues to keep our country functioning, all of which obviously are essential right now. What do you expect will be the fate of this bill? And is there any way to implement the provisions included in this bill in any other way if it doesn't pass legislatively?
Well, of course, I was hoping that there would be a carve out at a minimum to the filibuster to protect democracy reforms like this one, like voting rights. If that isn't going to happen, and again, I can't accept that because that's basically saying that we're going to lose one of the most potent tools we have to protect the right to the vote. There is still a pathway for the Protecting Our Democracy Act or elements of it. It can be taken up in pieces. As long as the job gets done, that's what I care about. Some of those pieces have been sponsored by Republicans in the past. There's no reason not to take them up now, except they live in fear of Donald Trump. And Donald Trump views this package, or he potentially views this package, as an indictment of his presidency. So fear is keeping them from supporting their own proposals in the past. But there is still a pathway even without filibuster reform.
I also don't think the hypocrisy of them having supported something in the past is going to stop them from failing to support it now. I'm looking at the Voting Rights Act that was passed 98-0 in 2006. And now you can't find a single Republican senator willing to put his or her name on it. And with that said, while we're on the subject of hypocrisy, Kevin McCarthy had threatened to kick you off of your committees if Republicans retake the House in this next midterm cycle. What's your response to that?
Well, a couple of things. McCarthy understands that I, probably more than just about anybody else in the House, held the former president to account for his corruption and his misconduct. And so he's doing Trump's bidding. But he's also a very weak Republican leader, which means that he's beholden to the craziest components of his conference. And so he is also responding to the Marjorie Taylor Greenes, who are demanding retribution for her removal from her committee. And so he's catering to the lowest common denominator. And, look, quite apart from his threats against me, of far greater significance is the reality that if he were to become speaker, he will vote to overturn the next presidential election if Trump loses. After all, he supported overturning the last one. And this time he could succeed, which is just why he can never be allowed to become speaker. But when you brought up, speaking of hypocrisy, let's talk about Kevin McCarthy. I was thinking about the fact that earlier last year, rather, he said that he would definitely speak to the January 6th committee. And of course, now he is singing a very different tune.
Now, we did see Republicans in a number of states, in Pennsylvania and I believe 6 other states that Joe Biden won in November, that tried to cast a separate slate of electors for Trump. And that issue has largely been ignored. I think now it's finally coming to the forefront. Do you expect to see any accountability for this?
There really needs to be accountability. And of course, we're investigating all these things in the January 6th committee. But it's important that the Justice Department be looking into these things. When I watched Merrick Garland last week, I was so proud that we have a person of integrity again running the Justice Department after 4 disastrous years of Bill Barr and Jeff Sessions and Matt Whitaker. I mean, it was just a cast of horribles. But at the same time, while he talked about accountability over January 6th and included people who were not there and pledged to follow the evidence wherever it leads, he didn't talk about all of the other lines of effort to overturn the election, which involved the former president, for example, trying to coerce the Secretary of State in Georgia to find 11,780 votes that don't exist, but also may include forged certificates of electors or other efforts that may have violated the criminal laws. And so I think all of those things need to be investigated where there are serious allegations of impropriety. by the Justice Department, not just by Congress. And one thing I do want to clarify, because I hear a lot of misapprehension about this in the press and elsewhere, the Justice Department is not waiting for us to make a referral. They cannot wait for us to make a referral. And what's more, they don't view it as their responsibility or their job to wait on Congress. So they should be doing it now, independent of anything we're doing.
With that said, I mean, what is actually the job of the January 6th committee? Is it to help lay out the investigation, help lay out the facts that the Justice Department could then use if they need to, but the Justice Department will then will regardless continue to move forward with their own investigation? Do they work not necessarily in tandem, but just complementary to each other?
Our responsibility is to fully oversee the facts, report the facts, and legislate in a way that protects the country going forward. So we don't have another effort to overturn a presidential election. We don't have another violent attack on the Capitol. So our role is predominantly oversight and legislation. Our role is not prosecution. Now, it may very well be that facts that we discover are going to be important to the Justice Department. But it shouldn't be the case, and it must not be the case, that the Justice Department is somehow waiting on us. We're looking into, for example, the facts of the attack itself, the role of these white nationalist groups. The Justice Department just indicted a bunch of people for seditious conspiracy. They didn't wait for us to finish our investigation to do that. And so if others were involved in that seditious conspiracy, higher ups were involved, they should be investigating it. But they should also be investigating other lines of effort that may have also violated the law to overturn the election.
Now, for most of us out here on the outside who don't have legal backgrounds, we look at this investigation and we see stuff like the fact that Donald Trump was caught on a recording asking the Georgia Secretary of State to find 11,780 votes, exactly one more vote than he lost by. And it's been a year, and we still haven't seen any accountability for those up top. And like you just mentioned, we are seeing our first sedition charges for members of the Oath Keepers. But is the process moving at a rate that you would expect it to move at? Because for the rest of us, we see this stuff and it's been so long, and the fact that there hasn't been any accountability leads people to believe that it's not going to happen.
First of all, I have to preface this by saying I don't have visibility into what Justice is doing, the Justice Department. They keep their investigations confidential, which they should. So all I can tell you is what I see from the outside. Nonetheless, from the outside, you can often see whether an investigation is progressing or not progressing, because you often see public reports of grand juries that are meeting and the issues that they're examining. I think that the Justice Department began with those on the ground on January 6th in the hope of not only prosecuting them, but also getting their cooperation on those higher up the food chain. Now, is that moving fast enough? The Justice Department would say they're prosecuting hundreds of individuals that it took time for them to identify because they were not arrested on the 6th. So they're, given COVID restrictions and everything else, they're moving very quickly. But nonetheless, I don't see the kind of indications I would expect to see at this point of investigations involving those at higher levels. But even more significantly, potentially, I don't see evidence of investigation of these other lines of effort to defraud the American people of their vote. And that does concern me.
Now, you wrote the book on an unelected authoritarian regime trying to take power in the U.S. I mean, literally, Midnight in Washington, how we almost lost our democracy and still could. You literally wrote the book. We know that the threat is there. We can see it in broad daylight, and that's especially evident in moments like these. But what's the solution here? What do you say to people who've watched as we failed to pass a carve-out for voting rights, for example, to secure our democracy, who feel like we're doomed? What would you say to those people?
I would say this: look, we're a very resilient country. We've been through worse than this. This too shall pass. But what we do in this moment is really going to determine how quickly it passes and how much damage we have to suffer in the meantime. This is not an opportunity for despair. We don't have the luxury of despair. We've got to be motivated. The other side is motivated. we must be motivated to save our democracy. And, look, we've been through a civil war. We've been through decades of struggle in terms of civil rights. We've been up against some really difficult challenges historically, world wars, Vietnam. It's not for the faint of heart. Moving the country forward is not for the faint of heart. So don't give up, don't give in. As John Lewis said, we have to keep on keeping on and keep the struggle going. And our democracy is worth it.
Yeah, I think that's a great line. We don't have the luxury of wallowing in despair here because the other side is motivated. I think that sums it up perfectly. So with that said, we'll leave it there. Congressman Schiff, thank you so much for taking the time. It's always great having you on.
Thank you. Great to be with you.